Welcome back to the second session of the Lewis Hahn Lectures. And it's going to be, in this case, my pleasure to introduce and recommend to your attention, it's pretty words, aren't they? Adrienne, I call her Adrienne because I had a girlfriend named Adrienne when I was a teenager. Adrienne Dengerink Chaplin, related to Charlie Chaplin's family, your husband is. So, anyway. But Adrienne and I came up with the idea for the Langer Circle. Do I dare say where?
Warsaw.
No.
No?
Krakow.
Oh, Krakow.
But not exactly Krakow. Somewhere outside of Krakow. We were touring Auschwitz. And it's a very heavy experience, which I recommend to absolutely every member of the human race. So, anyway, one of the things that happened was I met Adrienne in Krakow at the International Congress of Aesthetics. What, 400 papers and one on Langer? Hers? I was at the session. I was like, finally somebody's talking about Langer. One of the things that has happened though, and actually I think Jared has sort of set us up very nicely for this, and I hope whoever watches the next YouTube video will have watched yours. So, YouTube video? Troy, you can edit this out if you want. One of the things that has happened is that the aesthetics people, their conference it's about every 4 years. It started like in 1924, somewhere in there. There's hardly any philosophy at the conference, and part of the reason is that philosophers abdicated the role of talking in serious ways about aesthetics in the middle of the 20th century. And when they came back, they didn't realize that there was a whole world of people who weren't philosophers who knew a whole lot more about aesthetics than they did. However, it does turn out that it wasn't a bad thing that I held up the Danto volume in the last because, of course, Langer was his teacher. And he held her in the highest of esteem. He said to me any number of times, he said, easily the finest mind at Columbia when I was there, and they treated her awfully. Such was the 20th century and the kind of philosophy that Jared was lamenting in the previous paper. But that said, the Aesthetics Congress, they're not hostile to philosophy, they just don't care about it. And it turns out that they do theory perfectly well without our permission. Now, there's a lot of people at this conference who aren't philosophers. And part of the reason is that Langer reaches out to all of these folks. Adrienne does art criticism, and journalism related to art, in addition to being a historian of philosophy and of ideas. When I met her, she was working on a book on Langer. She was working on a book on Langer, and you had been for a long time. This was, what, 20, 25 years in the making? Something like that? Roughly. Yeah, anyway, because this is 2013, and this came out in 2020? Yeah. So in any case, it was in a relatively advanced stage at that time. I was very excited about it because I could tell from talking to Adrienne that she had done all the stuff that I haven't ever and wasn't ever going to have time to do in terms of the digging, especially into the figures that I don't, like Scheffer, that I don't know very well. Wittgenstein, I have no inclination to dig into that. And so anyway, and I found out what she was doing. Well, this is the book you need. It's the only book you need. And those of us who have read it know it's the only book you need. This pretty
Sorry,
well.
Bob.
Yeah, sorry, Bob. Actually, though, what this does is it gives you all the roots and the sources. Bob gives you the philosophy and the moving parts and the structures. So actually, it's not the only book. You need two books. You need Bob's and this one. And so anyway, I was really excited when this finally appeared because this is the book we have needed to sort of give the spread of who Langer was and what she did. And it had to be a labor of love because the amount of effort that went into this book is simply incredible, and the results are simply incredible as well. So anyway, I introduced someone who needs no introduction because of this book. But I will say that what we discovered walking around Auschwitz was that we knew different people who were all interested in Langer. And we started counting. And it turned out there were a lot that just between me and her. And then in Warsaw in 2017, Bob and Adrienne and a bunch of us gathered to more or less form the circle, but then the work still had to be done. Iris and Adrienne and a couple of folks at Utrecht and Peter Wendell and a couple of others did this hard work to get the circle up and running. So anyway, in many ways, the founder of our feast is among us. You already know her, but now make her feel even more welcome. Adrienne Dengerink.
Thank you very much, Randall. I'm going to show slides which are, have quite small print because I'm going to use Bob's CV as a text. And so it's not my fault, but because there's so much of Bob's CV that I have to... so it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be invited to address the work of Bob Innis. And I want to thank Randall and the American Institute for Philosophical and Cultural Thought for hosting the Louis E. Hahn Memorial Lecture and for hosting it in this incredibly wonderful and stimulating and aesthetically and cultural rich setting. And I, for one, find it always extremely stimulating to be in an environment like this, just confirming that we are embodied creatures interacting and responding to our environment. So I really, it's a heartfelt thank you to you and Gay to open your house in this way to have a conference here, which is absolutely marvelous. So thank you. So when asked to speak about Innis' work, it was an obvious place to start with his CV. He looked already scared. And which, as it turns out, was incredibly impressive and quite a revelation. So I will look at it closely throughout the talk and reference it at several points. I had, of course, been familiar with his many fine articles and, of course, his seminal book on Susanne when working on my own research. At that time, but had not been fully aware of his broad range of scholarship and his intimidatingly prolific output. At least 10 books, and this is just a few of it, and well over 100 book chapters and articles in journals ranging from the International Philosophical Quarterly to Semiotica and the Journal of Speculative Philosophy. So to give you just a brief glance, these are between 1991 and 2022. These are between 1979 and 1986. So 2 slides just to cover the books. And then here, 2 slides of articles and book chapters just the last 4 years. And I know there are more to come even. So these are two slides with here between 1991 and 2022, and then let me see now, and 2020 and 21. Oh, I think there are more. No, we go to here. Now, my purpose in this session is to look at his output over the years and seek out certain themes and patterns in his philosophical trajectory, with particular attention to the notion of Gestalt. In doing so, I am, with Langer, mindful of the fact that there is no single pattern of the world, or, in this case, someone's writings, and that one might be able to discern a multiplicity of forms and patterns depending on the focus of attention and one's primary interest. With that in the back of our minds, we can start our journey and begin with looking at Innis' early works. As is clear from this slide, in his early period, Innis was deeply immersed in the works of Michael Polanyi, a Hungarian-British philosopher of science, best known for his notion of tacit knowledge, rooted in pre-rational perceptions or beliefs and passions. Innis starts with a lengthy 31-page article in The New Scholasticism in 1973, culminating in a masterful overview of Polanyi's life and work in an in memoriam in the Zeitschrift für Allgemeine Wissenschaftstheorie in 1977. During the same time, he presented several lectures on Polanyi at both American and European conferences and universities. And it is in the presence of Polanyi that we are first made aware of what will become a red thread, even if not a foregrounded theme, weaving through in his research and interest throughout his lectures and presentations, the notion of Gestalt. Now, we know from Polanyi himself that he was deeply indebted to Gestalt theory. As he writes in the preface of his seminal book Personal Knowledge, with its radical proposal for an alternative conception of scientific knowledge in 1958, I have used the findings of Gestalt psychology as my first clues to this conceptual reform. Scientists have run away from the philosophic implications of Gestalt. I want to countenance them uncompromisingly. So that he says already at page 7 of his preface, he really starts with quite a bold opening statement and an empathetic endorsement of Gestalt psychology in this major influential work. So throughout his life, Innis will return to Polanyi in his publications and his lectures. These are the publications. Can you see it at the back? Okay. And many good. Yeah, exactly. It's a Gestalt, isn't it? And his lectures. These writings on Polanyi are interspersed with articles and chapters on major European thinkers, including Gadamer, Habermas, Heidegger, as well as older giants such as Hegel and Aquinas. But then, among them, we encounter for the first time the name of a lesser-known European figure called Karl Bühler. It occurs in the title of a lecture for the Second World Congress of the International Association for Semiotic Studies at the University of Vienna in July 1979, called The Semiotic Relevance of Bühler's Sprachtheorie. 3 years later, this is followed by Innis' first monograph called Karl Bühler, Semiotic Foundations of Language Theory. It's the second book in the series Topics in Contemporary Semiotics, edited by Thomas and Jean Seebock and published by Plenum Press in 1982. Now, after that, we notice several more lectures and at least 7 articles. Indeed, Karl Bühler will capture Innis' attention, scholarly attention, for well over a decade. Here are the lectures, and here are even more book chapters on Bühler. So, who is Karl Bühler, and what sparked Innis' interest in him to the extent that he devoted several articles and the first book to him? So, Karl Bühler was a German psychiatrist, psychologist, linguist and philosopher of language, known for his Gestalt psychology, who lived between 1879 and 1963. Here he is. So Bühler emphasized the fact that meaning does not originate in the isolated individual, but in the social context of its animal and human ambience, in an active and reciprocal communicative exchange. This insight in the social use aspect of linguistic meaning and the fact that speech was fundamentally a speech action, or in Austin's later terminology, a speech act, was to have a major influence on scholars working in philosophy of language and developmental psychology, as well as on philosophers such as Cassirer, Habermas, Mukorowski, Imgarden, Roman Jacobson, and indeed Michael Polanyi. He has also influenced several of his own students, including Karl Popper, who did his PhD under him, and ethologist Konrad Lorenz. Now, Bühler and his wife Charlotte herself an influential developmental psychologist, were close friends of the Wittgenstein family. They were the ones that facilitated the first meeting between Wittgenstein and Moritz Schlick at a home of Wittgenstein's sister, Margaret Stonborough Wittgenstein, that led to Wittgenstein's acceptance to join the Vienna Circle for at least some of its sessions, and even then never quite enthusiastically. Although Wittgenstein never mentions Bühler, there are clear resonances of both Karl and Charlotte Bühler's conception of language in his later notion of meaning as use, which was confirmed by his own study of language development in children while working as an elementary school teacher in Austria. Now, Bühler's major work included the following: Die Krise der I can't speak German anymore. I need psychology. Psychology, okay, yeah. I haven't spoken German for so long. And then the Axiomatik der Sprachwissenschaften, and that was translated by Innis in 1982. And none of Bühler's work were translated during his lifetime. That's correct, is it, Bob?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were the first to translate him.
I was the first to translate that, but there's a long history of why. When you look at this whole mixture of things, you say, how was that? Well, the fact is, many of the issues came from a lot of international meetings where people asked me to do this and that, and they say, we want it at this time. I said, what? You know?
Yes.
So you see, there's a lot of bunching together, but a lot of those things took a lot of time to ultimately appear.
Yeah.
But it wasn't, I wasn't submitting these things blind. It was because everybody said, would you do this for us?
Quite.
And then I'd say,
But you must
yes.
have wanted to do it.
Right, so that's
Yeah.
part of it, but I think that this was in the axiomatic book came from another meeting where the German editor of that had asked me whether it should be done. So it wasn't that I sought it out, but I was willing to do it because
exactly.
of the longer footnotes on Bühler.
We come to that. We come to that.
Very, very important for saying, yeah.
Don't steal my thunder. So Bühler is best known for his last work on the theory of language, the representational function of language, even though that was not translated into English until 1990, in which he presented his organon model of language and communication. And organon in this context means tool. So this, very briefly, is his organon model of language. And he identifies three functions of language: the expressive function, the representation function, and the appellative function. And it's not difficult to see that it kind of roughly maps onto Langer's notions of expressive, the first one, and that's more like self-expressive, so that would be ouch or wow. And then the representation function would map onto the symbolic, referential, and the last one, the appellative function, would be the signal. So if you say lunch is at 1, it's something you act upon. It's not just a statement. So building on the views of the German philosopher and linguist Wilhelm von Humboldt, Bühler was particularly interested in the way language always reflects a distinct outlook on life, a particular worldview. He had been fascinated with the relation between a perceptual mark or audible phoneme and its connotative meaning as represented by a symbol or gestalt. For Bühler, vocables and phonemes are the minimal diacritical units used to articulate differences in meaning, but the same for him applies to words. As he put it in Sprachtheorie, phonemes are sound marks in the word's tonal reality, and in every word they can be counted. But the word image is also Gestalt-like. It has a tonal phase or aspect that also changes like a human face in the changing course of the expressive or appellative function. Indeed, what has to occupy quite generally the language theorist is the remarkable constancy of the phonematic signaling of word images in the course of their changing sound phase. So this is why Bühler considers phonology as the study of speech sounds on its own, no matter how empirically rooted and technically sophisticated, as not enough. It needs a Gestalt theory to fully understand the way words and language work. As he puts it, phonology today accomplishes only the first step of its task of a systematically constructed theory of diacrisis and has to be instructed by Gestalt theory in order to take the second step. And Innis comments on this, saying there is a marked back and forth oscillation in Bühler's theory of language between properly semiotic and Gestalt considerations, something that had already been a theme in Die Krise der psychology. Bühler wanted to establish two radically different aspects of the word, its Klanggesicht, tonal phase, and its phonemetomatisch signalement, phonematic signaling character. This, so I suggest, answers at least in part the question what sparked Innis' interest in Bühler. And you have to confirm it. His intriguing account of the symbol's interplay between the Gestalt and the semiotic, the form and the meaning, that had also attracted the interest of Popper and Polanyi. So how did Innis become aware of Bühler? And now we come to the story. Here it becomes interesting. Although he had come across a footnote referring to Bühler in Polanyi's personal knowledge, it appears that it was primarily a footnote in Susanne Langer's Philosophy in a New Key that had led him on to this, at that time, rather obscure thinker, at least in English-speaking circles. We are told by Innis, as you can read in his abstract, that he found a copy of Philosophy in a New Key in a bookstore in Rome in 1963, which must have coincided with his first year at the Gregorian University. Yet Langer's name does not occur in any of his presentations or writings until 14 years later in an article comparing her and Nelson Goodman through a Polanyian lens, Art, Symbol and Consciousness, a Polanyi gloss on Susan Langer and Nelson Goodman, and we will forgive him the misspelling of Susanne Langer's name.
I didn't do that. It was corrected on the proof, and the people, when it was sent to the printer, they had changed it back by saying, no, that can't be right.
Okay.
So, of course, there it is in print for all these years, right?
Okay.
And you get the blame for it.
I get the blame for being alphabetical.
Actually, it took me some work, some time to figure out that it was about Langer and Goodman, because in your biography it doesn't have the subtitle. So it was only when I went to the article that I saw that those names occurred.
I've lived with that for us, what, since you run and hide in the phone booth.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the next one was not until 20 years later. So From Feeling to Mind, a note on Langer's notion of symbolic projection. After that, however, there is a veritable explosion of lectures, articles and book chapters on Langer. And again, so it becomes smaller and smaller, the print. And you can see Langer's name in those publications and presentations as well. Including, of course, his major work, Susanne Langer in Focus. Yet, considering that these publications all followed his extensive studies on Karl Bühler and his first purchase of a copy of Philosophy in New Key in Rome in 1963, let us go back to the context of the footnote that triggered this long diversion. The footnote occurs in the context of a discussion of symbolic perception. And on the previous page of the quote where the footnote is added, Langer says, the power of understanding symbols, that is, of regarding everything about a sense datum as irrelevant except a certain form that it embodies, is the most characteristic trait of mankind. It issues in an unconscious, spontaneous process of abstraction, which goes on all the time in the human mind, a process of recognizing a concept in any configuration given to experience and forming a conception accordingly. And then we have the quote which leads to the footnote. A word, likewise, taken as a sound unit, and we saw Bühler talking about that earlier, becomes a symbol to us for some item in the world. And now the power of seeing configurations as symbols come into play. We make patterns of denotative symbols, and they promptly symbolize the very different but analogous configurations of denoted things. A temporal order of words stands for a relational order of things. When pure word order becomes insufficient, word endings and prefixes mean relationships. From these are born prepositions and other purely relational symbols. And that is then followed by that footnote with just a reference to his work and Wegener's work. And that called Bob's
That struck the match.
attention, and away with Langer when we go to Bühler. What is interesting about these two passages we just read is that they describe what are generally considered the two fundamental principles of Gestalt perception. That is, first, the seeing of a figure against an undefined background, and second, the seeing of a structural pattern and configuration in terms of markers such as similarity, proximity, continuity, etc. Now, these two principles also conform to the two main types of form she had come to identify. That is, form as shape and form as relational or logical structure. And while in her early work on logic she had focused primarily on the idea of form as a relational or logical structure, in her later work on art she paid more attention to form as shape or contour, as she explained it herself in Problems of Art. There seem indeed to be two meanings of the word form involved in the two fields, respectively. A logician, mathematician, or careful epistemologist consider form as the logical form of discourse, the structure of propositions expressed either in ordinary language or in the refined symbolism of the rational sciences. Yet, artists do speak of form and know what they mean. And moreover, their meaning is closer than that of the logicians to what the word originally meant, namely visible and tangible shape. The artistic form is a perceptual unity of something seen, heard, or imagined, that is the configuration or gestalt of an experience. And then she proceeds to describe this notion of gestalt in terms very familiar to Gestalt theories of her time. Gestalten are rooted in abstraction. Gestalt symbols are the most elementary abstractions of ordinary sense experience. The abstractions made by the ear and the eye, the forms of direct perception, are our most primitive instruments of intelligence. They are genuine symbolic materials, media of understanding, by whose office we apprehend a world of things and of events that are the history of things. Likewise, all thinking begins with seeing, not necessarily through the eye. These are all familiar texts, but if you look at it through the lens of Gestalt, it seems to say something different. But with some basic formulations of sense perception in a particular idiom of sight, hearing, or touch, normally of all the senses together. For all thinking is conceptual, and conception begins with the comprehension of Gestalt. So a Gestalt is the result of a scanning process whereby salient features are emphasized and abstracted while others are suppressed. It has a tendency to closure of form, to simplification. And she quotes, for example, philosopher of cybernetics Norbert Wiener, who argues that one of the reasons for being able to interpret line drawings is that the eye receives its most intense impressions and boundaries, and every visual image has something of the nature of a line drawing. So it kind of completes the contours. Yet, Gestalt perception is not necessarily visual. Echoing Bühler's theory of phonemes, she describes how a baby hears new vocables. A sound, such as dada or mama, probably, has been conceived, and his diffuse awareness of vocalizing gives way to an apparently delightful awareness of a vocable. A new vocable is an outstanding gestalt. And I have to admit, I was struck by how much her thinking revolves about this notion of gestalt. It was kind of a gestalt revelation once you look it through that lens. So Lange had read the works of Gestalt theorists Friedrich Sander and Heinz Werner. And again, as with so many other works, long before they were translated into English. So in the early 1920s, Lange herself had translated an article by Gestalt theorist Friedrich Sander entitled Structure, Totality and Experience and Gestalt, in which Sander coined the term actual genese, literally the genesis of actuality, which is echoed in Whitehead's concept act or actual entity. And Franz Riefert even suggests that Whitehead may well have encountered this term first through Lange's translation, before it was published in a survey of psychology in the 1930s. In short, Lange was both familiar with and very appreciative of the experiments and writings of the founders of Gestalt psychology, and argues that unless the Gestalt psychologists are right in their belief that Gestaltung is one of the very nature of perception, I do not know how the hiatus between perception and conception, sense organ and mind organ, chaotic stimulus and logical response is ever to be closed and welded. A mind that works primarily with meanings must have organs that supply it primarily with forms. Now, had there been time, it would also have been good to show the connections between Lange's notion of Gestalt, as described above, and Kant's notion of the productive imagination and the transcendental schema, which serves a very similar function in terms of its spontaneous synthesizing activity. And it is also worth noting that Cassirer scholar Donald Verene refers to Cassirer's symbol theory as essentially a reshaping of Kant's idea of schema, that is, from a critique of reason into a philosophy of culture. And for those interested, I refer to my chapter on Cassirer in my book on Lange. But let us once again return to Bühler and ask, how did Lange come across his work when none of it had yet been translated? And here we do encounter another interesting quirk of history. The most likely scenario is that Lange was introduced to Bühler's thought, and that of other Gestalt theorists, by Karl Bühler himself. Let me explain. In 1921, Lange had married Harvard student William Leonard Lange, who had just finished his master's degree in modern history, modern European history. And upon graduation, William had been awarded a year-long fellowship at the University of Vienna, which meant that he and his newlywed wife, Susanne, set off to Vienna, where they arrived in the summer of 1922. It so happened that in that same year, Karl Bühler had been appointed as professor of psychiatry at the University of Vienna, at its Institute of Psychology. So this made it possible for Lange to attend his pioneering lectures, in German of course, and become acquainted with his theories of communication, his philosophy of language, and his Gestalt psychology. And as we can now clearly see, many of Bühler's ideas on language formation and Gestalt found their way into Philosophy in a New Key and other writings. And even though his magnum opus Sprachtheorie was not published until a decade later, he will quite likely have shared several of its ideas in those early lectures. So let me finally return to the intellectual trajectory of Robert Innis and his ability to recognize and trace connecting patterns between diverse thinkers. In the opening paragraph of his first article on Langer, in which he compares Nelson Goodman with Langer, Innis himself reflects on this process of comparison as follows. It is a theoretically satisfying and fruitful task to compare and contrast positions developed without thematic relationship to one another. The dialectical process of juxtaposition of similars and contraries can light up more clearly the relevant structures of each position and, more importantly, can spot inadequacies regarding the matter itself. I would like to perform this task in the case of two cognate aesthetic models developed by Susanne Langer and Nelson Goodman. Throughout his oeuvre, Innis shows himself a master in engaging in this theoretically satisfying and fruitful task, as can be seen on his next slide. So there are numerous articles and presentations where he compares thinkers. So Dewey and Peirce, Peirce and Polanyi, Polanyi and Langer, James and Polanyi, James and Husserl, Langer and Peirce, Langer and Dewey, Dewey and Alexander, and more. So he returns again to constantly tries to make these connections between diverse thinkers. And in 2009, he returns again to a comparison between Langer and Polanyi, in which he asked the question, why would or even should someone deeply interested in the work of Susanne Langer turn to Michael Polanyi's work for insight, as well as perhaps an intellectual challenge, and vice versa? And then he concludes the article with a kind of a pragmatist inflection in his answer, saying that Langer's and Polanyi's intellectual projects should themselves be seen as probes with different conceptual fields. They are fundamentally probes we have to learn to use, that is, validate, and not just theoretically verify, in order to open up the space of meaning making that we ourselves are. So I suggest that in his ability to compare the different probes of diverse thinkers is both intuitive and analytical, in that it requires an open and receptive attitude to see previously unnoticed patterns and configurations, but to also subsequently analyze these in terms of similarities and differences. And the word discursive comes from discurre. So curre is to run, like a current. And I have to verify if this is actually etymologically correct, but this is dia. So you could, discursive is in a sense a process of running to and from. So you go to one thing and then you say how is the same, and then you go to another and how is it different. So that is a kind of a discursive process which is part of our knowledge acquisition, in addition to having this Gestalt in the first place. You can't run to something which you haven't noticed or seen before. So I want to illustrate this now with the following slide. This I'm trying to. We can discuss if it's a model or an image. I think I can say a few things about that. So looking at the shapes and colors in the image, we can visually and mentally see different patterns and configurations depending on which color happens to stand out for us. If we, for example, focus on the golden browns of Polanyi and the bright blues of Bühler, we can see a pattern that foregrounds those two thinkers, with Lange's red receding in the background. But if we focus on the red of Lange, quite a different picture emerges, with the previously unnoticed red patches creating quite a different overall shape. Oh, that was the bigger circle. And finally, if we allow the other thinkers to be foregrounded as well, we start to see the various green and black patches emerge that we may have hardly noticed before. So this illustration shows how Innis has been able to connect, configure and reconfigure different individual thinkers in his work with a view to drawing up yet larger pictures of recurrent systematic themes, as can be reflected in his long list of books in the areas of his own specialization. So he draws on these figures, and that is all kind of comes back in his own thematic books. So in his areas of philosophy of language, semiotics, psychology, of perception, aesthetics, philosophy of culture, philosophy of religion, and more. Not only do these works testify to the depth and breadth of his thought, it also shows his lingual versatility. And Innis is well versed in many languages. His first book was a translation of Wittgenstein from the German. He speaks French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, Danish, and is also versatile in Latin. And he learned Hebrew through Latin. And he even translated a book from Latin. Let me see. Yeah, there. So
he knows Italian and Danish too.
I did mention that. I think you were dozing off there. Yeah. So hidden among all those publications, we can spot a translation of a Latin text on the psychology of language by the 18th century German philosopher Johann Christoph Hofbauer, who must also have caught your attention at that time. So it is precisely this rich, multilingual, historically attuned philosophical tapestry that makes the work of Innis so insightful and fertile. In stark opposition to analytic philosophers who believe original philosophy starts in a disembodied, timeless mind, Innis knows, with Alistair MacIntyre, that we are embodied, interdependent and traditioned creatures that are shaped by a long history of acting, thinking and believing that crosses multiple periods, cultures and languages. In a lecture he gave 2 years ago for the American Institute of Philosophical and Cultural Thought in the Creativity Conference.
It was during COVID, so he wasn't here.
No, but he still gave the lecture online. And it was entitled The Paradoxical Burden of Creativity and Originality. Innis reflects on the idea that new ideas arise to consciousness unforced, that is, without what Dewey called the mind's direct effort of wit and will. Instead of arising out of an imposing and controlling mind, new insights and ideas emerge from daydreaming and reverie. And I believe it is this reverie with its receptive, mindful attitude to what the world may, in its own time and place, seek to disclose, that joins philosophers and artists and scientists and scholars of all kinds in their ongoing efforts to make senses, and I use the plural here advisedly, to make senses of reality that can not only illuminate but also transform the world we live in. And because such revelation is not something that we can force out of the world or even are entitled to it, it will and should always be received as an unexpected gift by a receptive and grateful mind. In the same lecture, Innis mentioned in the lecture above, he quotes Ralph Waldo Emerson as saying that all originality is relative, and that the greatest genius is, in fact, the most indebted man. And if that is so, as I believe it is, we are privileged to have a genius amongst us. Hello.
I wonder if you know anything about, I noticed not so long ago that there is a footnote in Langer's dissertation. Towards the end, I think, where she's talking about art in an appendix, where she says something she makes in a footnote a reference to Wolfgang Köhler that suggests that she got it from him directly, not from something he wrote.
From who?
Wolfgang Köhler.
Okay, Köhler, yeah.
Oh. Psychologist.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And I was that struck me. It seemed quite obvious that I don't think it said personal communication, but it was put in such a way that it clearly seemed to be saying, he told me this.
Okay.
And so I'm just wondering, where was he and how would she have been likely to meet him?
Yeah, I don't know the answer, but I know someone who does. And that's Iris and her team, because they can
We can look this up.
That's right.
they can type it in their system and then find out when she had lunch with Köhler. That's so I don't know the answer to that.
You know, it's just sort of amazing to hear this talk, and it's like, who is this person? Oh, he's right there. God.
I hope I did you justice, Paul.
It's almost embarrassing. There is an explanation, but everybody else should have a chance to talk, but I have an explanation. You say, that's really weird. But there is a historical trajectory that was not planned.
No.
It was led from one to the other.
Yeah.
And you say, how can he do this in Danish? Or how come he does Italian? Hebrew? What's going on here?
Yeah, not
And
planned.
there is a sort of a coherent thing of friendly conversations that lead to various things. So how did I end up in Scandinavia? How did I end up in Denmark? And how did I end up in Estonia? Right? And
But
those
there is-
various places.
but there is a
But
coherent
there's
story.
simple explanation of why then you say, well, here's a chapter on cultural psychology. What does he have to do with cultural psychology? Because I spent 5 years working with cultural psychologists.
Yeah.
And they asked me to do things, right? So we work together on these various things, and vice versa, right? With Karl Bühler, that came from a meeting in Kronberg, outside of Frankfurt, many
But-
years ago.
But it's not entirely random, isn't it? I mean, again, it's a Gestalt element that you were alerted to something, other people were alerted to you. You saw those colleagues, you ended in those conversations. And so it has a coherence because the themes all add up and they all enrich each other and illuminate each other and expand.
Term in chemistry is valence. You have an attractor, a piece of yourself that can link on to something that somebody else is doing, allow them to connect with you. Not all elements can connect with other elements, but those that have the proper valence can do this.
Yeah.
That's the miracle.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly.
But I think also this issue of receptivity that you ended with, I mean, it's about being open and then making something of it.
There you
It's
go.
very Langerian. And it's a wonderful story to give as an example for other students. People who are young, things are strewn in your way. One conversation leads to another. You may not see how it's all going to add up in the end, but in the end, it's a beautiful job with that picture. It's a journey of a certain specific kind.
You have to be willing to be surprised.
Yeah, exactly.
And without being willing to be surprised or to take a risk, many years ago, my wife is Danish and studied at the University of Copenhagen, but I had a colleague that I had read his books in Danish. And we were out for dinner with him one night, and he said to me, I want you to know that our department at the University of Copenhagen has got a Fulbright professorship for you. I said, what? They never asked me. But they had to. So, next thing I know, I'm teaching with the whole set of graduate students at the University of Copenhagen in the courses that I had been teaching in English. So I walked in the first day and said, do you want the course in English or in Danish? And they said, Danish. So I taught ways of knowing, art and philosophy, philosophy and technology, and all these things. I made up the course in Danish.
How was your Danish?
But I mean, this is the anecdotes will show you have to be really flexible. There was an elderly gentleman sitting in the front there, and he wasn't a student normally. He just was there, and he smiled. Every once in a while, he would write something down. Because I said, what the hell is he writing down? He's not writing enough down to be taking notes, but he's obviously making a note. So about every 3 weeks, he would come up to me with this index card filled with 2 columns of words. The left side was Danish, and the right side was German. And he recognized that what I was doing on a number of occasions where I did not know the exact technical term in Danish, but I knew the term in German. I just made up the Danish word. So he would say, no, X does not equal Y. But if I hadn't done that, it would have made a very different, had a different effect on the students, because one of the students became a very well-known art historian in Denmark. And I actually was the monitor of her PhD thesis. But, you know, I knew I did it, and then 20 years later, she sends me another copy of her thesis and comes back into contact with me. And it's those types of things where you say, oh, you know, Louisa, that's actually fantastic, because she does all the analysis of political cartoons and all these various things. You're a long way from, you know, Gestalt theory to political cartoons, etc. I mean, from one point of view.
Yeah.
So you've got to be willing to take a risk, and to not be afraid of talking to people. But from Copenhagen, then one thing leads to another, and zingo, you end up with all these people asking you to do things, including in Tartu. And so you go to Estonia, you get a letter from Estonia that says, we have an EU visiting professorship for you, and it'll be at this date. Show up, show up, and teach. You know, and teach the students. It's a very famous semiotics department there in Tartu. But how did I get there? Because of an Estonian professor who was teaching in Massachusetts.
Yeah, and you work.
Who I knew. And he was now the Niels Bohr professorship in Aalborg. So I get a 5-year appointment in Aalborg. Not anything that you run after. It's just something that leads you to something else that's interesting.
But you have to be open to it.
You
And if
have
I
to be
may
open.
say so,
Yeah.
my generation of Anglo-American philosophers is not as open
Right.
to traveling elsewhere and finding treasures in places you don't know ahead of time what it is. There's been a tremendous leveling.
And specialization.
Yeah, the professionalization, maybe Jared was talking about, I mean, the English, this whole idea of the journal article. It's a very different world, so it would be nice if we could return to this world.
Yeah.
But yeah, in my abstract I made a comment also that indeed our institutional academia doesn't allow for the time to be open and receptive. If you have to
That's true.
do your deadline by one, it's publication. So you cannot sit back. Which when I was studying in Amsterdam for the university, a small philosophy faculty, very very good, but the professors would almost tell the students, don't write your essay too quickly. And so philosophy is like wine. It needs to kind of ferment and needs to sit and so they would really encourage
I was the
you.
last one at Harvard to be like that. We
Oh,
were
really?
told not to publish.
Yeah.
I mean, Rawls published 1972. You know, Capella was 50 before
Interesting.
Right,
the idea was you were looked down on.
Yeah.
if you published it.
I was the very last
Whoa, that's
generation.
interesting. Yeah.
And so the world changed
Yeah.
after that, and I was
Yeah.
thankfully not professionalized.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like students at other
Yeah.
universities.
And I
probably
think that
did.
is really a problem
Huge
at the moment.
advantage.
Yeah.
Huge.
And you notice simultaneously people quit reading, they're too busy publishing.
Yeah.
And for the dean to count the books, nobody reads the books,
Yeah.
count the books.
Ironies. But Bob, you present your life like, well, they all came to you. It sounds like this opportunity came to you and then that opportunity.
For a reason.
You know, it's sort of strange. It is sort of strange. There's something accidental about it. It is also substantial and essential. That the accidental meetings with people and my other colleagues ended up forwarding my essential interests that were already there. So that's why I could say yes.
Yeah.
Rather than, oh, well, maybe there's something interesting there, but it's a chance to get out of the country, right? Or whatever it was. It was never that. It was that, yeah, there is an intrinsic link here. So
Yeah.
you do it, right? And it leads to something else. But sometimes it leads to something you didn't want to do, but you do it because it's the payback to them, right? That is, you have to give something back and not just take it.
You know, Varela, whatever his first name is, you know, has this concept of laying down a path while walking. I mean, you just start walking and, oh my goodness, I have this whole path that I seem to be creating. But you do create it as you keep moving, right?
In nonlinear thermodynamics, they would call you a strange attractor.
Yeah. And yeah.
Oh, really? You are strange.
But you have multiple strange
That's it.
attractors, Bob.
Yeah. I mean, of course. Sorry.
It's what brings order out of chaos.
Something that Jared though was saying, I think that applies here.
Oh, yeah, the wonder.
About what we would want from our students, and in the sense that with the students, the real idea is to induce perplexity, to get them to wonder about something that they would not have wondered about or be perplexed about. So that induced perplexity can give them a form of a motive for development that was not planned, but once they've tasted it, they want to continue to eat this diet, or to order this menu.
Right.
And that can have sort of long-term consequences that appear in multiple ways, not just from Louisa sending me her doctoral dissertation, but I got a photo the other day. One of my students sent me from almost 20 years ago of her bookshelf with her cat lying on her bookshelf. She said, but I want you to look at the book. She said, do you recognize that blue and white binding? What was it? Philosophy in a New Key, the Harvard reprint.
There you go.
She was in my language, science, and simple course. What does she do? She has a big job on administrating the New Hampshire, the state of New Hampshire's public health system. She has an MBA, and she has had her own consulting firm, etc. Did she go on in philosophy? No, but she went on philosophically. It's adverbial and not substantive, etc. in that sense. And
Yeah, but you can also not do it without following the footnotes. That's the other point there. So you have to, the curiosity is not just kind of open and wonder, but it has to be active, following up the
yeah, I mean,
and there's a lot of discursivity there as well. So it's an interplay.
And
so my thing would be
and you're next. That's a good place to end, following the footnotes. The title.
All right.
You're next.